welcome to our second video in our series, in our Joke API tutorial series, highlighting how the API engine works. So in our previous video, we just went over the very basics, just to be able to call an API and get information back as quickly as possible. And we got back some jokes. In this video, we're going to expand on that by starting to explore some path construction capabilities. So our objective is some very basic URL construction options. And also, as part of that process, we'll see how to copy an API function from an existing one to a new API function. So let's take a look at Business Central. And remember, our Joke APIs are part of an API set. This is the only one that we have here. And then we have a couple of functions that we defined in our last video. With these functions, they were calling a URL that was essentially a single endpoint. If you also remember, we were looking at this Joke API to actually be our test site that we would actually retrieve jokes. So essentially, we entered a fully qualified URL in our API engine to be able just to go out and retrieve some information. The get single joke was using our default URL from our credentials table. So if we go back and take a look at that, look at the credential, you can see that we have a fully qualified URL. So really, it's going to get jokes from any category, a single joke, and ones that aren't offensive. And for our other API call, get programming jokes, we essentially just wanted it to get jokes from the category of programming. So for that, we specified a URL override, and we gave it the whole URL path to get 10 programming jokes that, again, are not offensive. So what do we want to do here? We'd like to make this more flexible so that we wouldn't have to specify the full URL every time that we wanted to create a new function. Eventually, and this will be in the next video, we want it to be able to dynamically change based on runtime. But for this video session, we're just going to go over the basics of what the different parts of a path are. So let's go back to our slides just for a second. And let's look at what the URL of API calls look like. So here's 4 examples from the Joke API. The top one is pretty simple. It will default to getting a single joke, and it will retrieve, it won't be in safe mode, which means you're at risk of getting offensive jokes back. So that's the base URL. There's another API call in the Joke APIs where we can retrieve the various categories of jokes that are available. So essentially, that's a different endpoint to be able to do that. And then we start going back to how we can tailor getting jokes. So for example, getting jokes from the programming category that are not offensive, and how many of them do we want? So 2 examples of essentially still getting jokes, but filtering on what exactly jokes that we want to get. So let's kind of break this apart a little bit. If we look at these 4 URLs, you can see that they always start with this base. So essentially, we call that the base URL. And then they have a path. So joke/any categories, joke/programming, joke/any are part of the path. We can look at this as maybe dividing it into 2 separate things, a fixed segment. So in other words, any API call that's going to get jokes is always going to have this joke in its path. However, a variable path may be, well, what category do we want the jokes in? So we can see for the joke API to get jokes, we have something that always needs to be there, and then something that can vary. Then we see this question mark here. So essentially in a URL, after the question mark, they're called query parameters. So we have two different types of query parameters that we see in here. One is the tag, a tag, which we're specifying safe mode, and another one where we're giving it a value, essentially a count of how many we want. So notice the difference here. So when we say amount equals 1, we consider that a key and a value. We're telling it what we want and what the value is. Okay? Versus safe mode is just a tag. There's no, safe mode equals true or safe mode equals false. It's just if safe mode appears in there, then that's the type of joke we want. So we essentially have a base URL, a path, which can be divided into fixed and variable, and then query parameters, which could be either tags or key values. Okay, so let's go back to Business Central and see how we can accomplish that. So the first thing that we're probably going to want to go fix is that in our credentials table, we specified a fully qualified URL. So if we can kind of think of what's in this credential table as being essentially, we want to put the base URL here. In other words, what doesn't change no matter what we call in the joke API. Now, I should never say never because there is an occasion when something may change for that. But for the vast majority of times, we're going to have this thing that we call a base URL. Okay, so let's go back. We now have the base URL in our credentials. But what's going to happen if we call this one, which was relying on that base URL? This one will still work because it had a URL override. So in other words, it's going to ignore what's in the credential table and just use its own thing. But this one didn't have anything associated with it. So it would fail. So what do we need to do here? So remember, we decided that it needs a path. So from the base URL, we need to establish a path. So let's just go here and say, well, the static path of this is going to be joke. So that's one piece of it. But now we also need a category. Okay? Category can be done with what we call an API variable, and then we can call it a URL path. So essentially, the way the API engine is going to put this together is it starts with the base URL, it adds the static path, and then it's going to add the URL path. So, or any URL paths that we have specified. So we'll call it, category. And it doesn't have a parent for right now, but essentially it's going to be a text value. The value processing type we're going to start with is static, meaning it can't change at runtime. In our next video, we'll kind of show how that works. But let's put in any for right now. Okay? The rest of this is more advanced. We'll get into later on. Because this is just a value, it's not a key value. We don't need a name for it. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So let's see. Do we have everything that we need here? Let's go ahead and try and see what happens. So if we kind of go back to the home and say, let's execute this now. We can see that we did create a message, and do we want to open it? And now, based on based on the way we built the query, you can now see that we took the base URL from the credentials, added the static path to it, and then after that, we put the category any. Okay. What we didn't do here, though, is say that we do not want an offensive joke. So let's go back and add that parameter. So essentially, we can add a second URL path to this. Or actually, this is a query parm, sorry. So essentially, a URL parameter, right? And we'll name this safe mode. And we'll also say that this is a text value, that it is going to be static, and the static value is safe dash mode. I believe that's what it says in the documentation. Okay. So let's see if this works now and what our URL is going to look like. So we go back and execute this. Again, we can look at the message, and you can see now we have a tag based on safe mode. By default, we're just getting a single joke. So we can look and see that there's nothing offensive in there. Safe is true, and we got one joke. Suppose the other thing that we didn't tell it is that specifically that we wanted an amount of 1. So let's go through and add that then. So that would be another parameter. So essentially, we'll add a new one. We want it to be active. We're going to call it amount. It will be a key value. Actually, that should have been key value text. The value still is going to be static. We're going to put in 1. Okay, but this time we need a name. So we're going to make it amount. And notice that our name that we're going to pass to the API is in lowercase, but the name we gave it here has an uppercase A. That allows us to differentiate between what the API wants it called and what we want to call it. Sometimes we may have the same name that we need to give different values to for different reasons. And then this is essentially our key to what is going to happen. So let's see what happens here. If we add this parameter and we go back and execute it. So you see we have no error. We got a joke from the pun category. And now our amount is 1. We specified the amount of 1 and that it should be safe mode. So that kind of gives us the basis of how we can build a path with our API engine. Let's actually do one other API call just to kind of show the difference. So we're going to call this one get joke categories. And let's go back and look to see if we wanted to get categories, we would have this on our path. Coming back here, we'll get the possible joke categories. Let's It's going to be a get. However, this time we're going to put categories there. We'll kind of copy all the rest of this down. So it is going to be JSON. And with the default processing method, I think everything else that we have here is probably okay. Yeah. So let's see what happens if we execute this joke. So notice that our static path is changed. We're not giving it any parameters whatsoever. We didn't do any parameters, path. We didn't do a URL override, so on. We're just going to be taking the base URL and adding the static path to it for this one. Let's go back, execute that. So we can see that we did not get an error, but we got back category information. If you remember, we could actually go and look at the data buffer. Sorry. And you can see we got back all the different categories in an array here that are possible. We got back some additional information, which essentially are aliases to these, but this is really what we wanted to get back. In our next session, we will explore how to on a future video, we'll explore how to map that information back to some table in Business Central. So one of the things I also said we would cover in this video is being able to copy an API function. So let's just go ahead and do that. And that's under our actions. And we can say copy API function. So if we wanted to quickly copy everything that we had done to a function to a new one, because maybe, we want a different category or so on, we don't have the variableness in it, or we just want maybe to do some testing. So we could actually copy this function to a different API set if we wanted to. But in our case, we'll just call it this, say OK. And once we're done, you see now we have our copy here, which everything is essentially the same as the one that we copied from, this get single joke, including the variables of URL parameters and the URL path. So let's kind of look at this. Let's maybe just change this to 10 for this one. And we'll just now change the name of this, although we're going to go through a rename, to get 10 jokes. And now it's no longer a copy. If I would have known that name beforehand, I wouldn't have needed to do this. Let's see. Just to get everything straight. And if we wanted to go ahead and execute this, and you can see, let's just go right to our data buffer to see what we got. You can see we essentially have 10 jokes this time from all different categories because we specified the random any category. Okay, so one thing left to do. We left this one where we did a URL override. And I suppose we could do that, but let's kind of get rid of this URL override. And so now we want them to be programming 10 and so on, right? So actually what I'm going to do is first delete this. Essentially, that was the URL override. So now it just knows about the base URL. So it is still going to be from the joke static path. We need a URL path that is essentially going to be category we want them from the programming section. Okay. We decided we want it to be 10, so we need URL parameters. 1, the amount. Key value text. It's static. Static value is going to be programming. And then we need a second one, which is going to be safe mode. And it's just going to be text. Oops, guess I didn't put that one in right. And it's going to be static. Its value is going to be safe mode. Okay, everything else should be good. Oh, we have a static name over here. Because it's key value, it needs a name and a value. Okay. So we're good. Let's see if this one works. Or did I do something wrong? So let's go back to execute it. So we didn't get an error, but essentially our URL used our base URL. We did the static path of programming, so we only want programming jokes. Oh, we didn't have an amount. Because I guess we put the amount programming in there and safe mode. So I'm guessing we only got one joke. All right, that was true. So let's go back and fix it. So that was in our parameters. Yep, sure enough, we put programming in there, and we want it really 10. Let's try that one more time. So this time we have the amount of 10. We look at our URL, it looks good. We'll go to the related data buffer. And voila, we have 10 jokes all from the programming session. Okay, so that's it for today. Hopefully you've gotten a little bit further in our quest to learn the API engine. Let's just go back. So for our next one, we will continue on building URL paths, but we'll see if we can get some variables that are determined at runtime, still without coding. So we still may not be to a production solution until we get some code in there. Maybe, maybe not. And then in the video after that, we'll start learning about what we can do that the data that is being returned by the API, what we can do with it. So thank you for listening, and until next time.